The year was 1347, and Europe was on the edge of terror. Word spread quickly of a terrible plague sweeping across the land. In towns, villages, and cities, people whispered about the Black Death, an illness that arrived without warning and brought only death. It wasn't like any sickness the world had ever known. It spread faster than anyone could understand, and no one could stop it. Families were wiped out in days, and the death toll climbed higher with every passing hour. The world as people knew it was changing, and fear was in the air. In the small, quiet village of Alston, life had been peaceful. The farmers worked the land, the children played in the fields, and the blacksmith, Thomas's father, spent his days shaping metal by the fire. The town had always been a place of comfort, a place where people could live without worry. But the news of the plague soon reached them. At first, it felt distant. It was something happening in faraway cities, like London or Paris. Surely, it couldn't touch their village. But no one knew how wrong they were. One crisp morning, a stranger arrived at the village. He was covered in dirt, his clothes torn, and his face pale. The man was rushed into the local tavern, where the villagers gathered. He was sick, his body trembling with fever, his skin covered in strange dark sores. The tavern keeper, a stout man named Jareth, immediately told everyone to stay back. But it was too late. The man had already been in the village for too long, and soon, others began showing the same signs. Thomas, the blacksmith's son, watched as the villagers struggled to make sense of what was happening. At first, it seemed like a simple illness, maybe a bad fever, something the doctor could easily cure. But as the days passed, more and more people fell ill, and the symptoms grew worse. The boils on the skin became larger, and the fever didn't go away. It took only a few days for the first death to occur. Then, another, and another. Soon, it seemed that everyone had someone in their family who was sick. The once thriving town of Alston quickly turned into a place of silence and sorrow. The villagers grew frantic. Whispers began to spread that the plague was a curse, a punishment sent by God. People believed they were being punished for their sins, and the fear grew stronger. Thomas had never believed in such things, but even he couldn't deny the horror unfolding around him. People were dying in the streets. Bodies were stacked like firewood outside the homes of the dead, waiting to be buried. The once bustling market was now empty, with only the sounds of mournful cries filling the air. By the end of the week, half the village had fallen ill, and the streets were empty except for the sick and the dying. Thomas couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. His father, the blacksmith, had become ill too, his hands shaking as he worked the forge. And Thomas's mother, a kind woman who had always taken care of the household, was bedridden with a high fever. It seemed as though no one could escape it. But amidst the terror, something strange happened one night. Thomas had been working late in the smithy, his hammer ringing against the anvil as he shaped a piece of metal. The night was calm, too calm. The air was heavy, and the usual sounds of the village, the rustling of leaves, the low murmur of voices, were gone. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Thomas stepped out into the cold night to get some air. The sky was clear, but there was a strange feeling in the air. He turned toward the old church that sat atop the hill above the village. The church, once a place of comfort and peace, now seemed dark and ominous. At first, Thomas thought he saw a figure standing near the church, just outside the light cast by the flickering torches. The figure was tall and dressed in dark clothes, too dark to make out any details. The figure stood still, watching the village from the shadows. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the figure that frightened him, it was the way it stood, perfectly still, as if it were waiting for something. There was something unnatural about it. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly turned and walked toward the church. It vanished into the darkness, like it had never been there at all. Thomas stood frozen, his mind racing. Who was that? Why had he been watching the village? He looked around, but the village was quiet, still as death itself. There was no one else outside. The figure had disappeared into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. As Thomas stood there, feeling the weight of the silence around him, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. The plague, the deaths, the figure in the shadows, it all felt connected, as though there was something darker at play, something beyond his understanding. Was it really just a punishment from God? Or was there something else behind it all? Was this plague a natural disaster, or was there something more sinister at work? Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the Black Death had come to Alston for a reason. A terrible, ancient reason. And now, as the village continued to fall apart around him, Thomas realized that he might be the only one left to uncover the truth. But at what cost? Could he survive the mysteries that were beginning to unfold, or would the darkness that seemed to watch over the village swallow him whole? As the night grew colder and the village fell deeper into chaos, Thomas knew one thing for sure: the worst was yet to come. The plague had not only claimed the lives of countless people, but it also brought with it something even more destructive: fear. As the Black Death spread across Europe, panic gripped entire towns, cities, and villages. People were desperate for answers, and when no one could explain the sudden wave of death, rumors began to take root. One of the most dangerous rumors to spread was that the Jews were responsible for poisoning the wells, for spreading the disease that killed so many. The idea spread like wildfire, and soon, towns across Europe were gripped by madness. In the small town of Alston, Thomas could feel the tension in the air. Every day, more villagers were falling ill, and more people were dying. The once peaceful streets were now filled with whispers of suspicion and fear. Thomas had grown up in a world where people looked out for one another, where differences were accepted, and where he had never known hatred. But now, that was changing. It started with a conversation in the tavern. A man named Ammon, a regular patron, began speaking loudly about the Jews. "It's them," Ammon said, his voice shaking with rage. "They're the ones who've poisoned the wells. They've come to destroy us all." His words seemed to echo in the room, and soon others began nodding in agreement. The seeds of fear and hatred were planted. At first, Thomas didn't believe it. He had known a few Jewish families in the neighboring towns, and they had always been kind to him. They were no different from anyone else, he thought. But as the disease spread and more people died, even Thomas began to question. Could it really be true? Were the Jews responsible for the deaths of so many? The rumors didn't stop there. Soon, stories spread of violent attacks on Jewish communities in nearby towns. In one place, an entire Jewish town was burned to the ground, the people inside killed in the flames. In another, the Jewish families were dragged from their homes and thrown into the river. Everywhere the Black Death went, fear followed, and the Jewish people became the scapegoat. The violence began to grow closer to Alston. One evening, a rider came into the village, breathless and panicked. "They're coming," he gasped. "The mob from the next town over is coming here. They're after the Jews." The rider told the villagers that a nearby town had been consumed by chaos. An angry mob had stormed the Jewish quarter, murdering men, women, and children without mercy. The town was in flames, and the mob was heading toward Alston. Thomas felt a deep, uneasy feeling settle in his stomach. The village was on edge, and he could see the fear in the faces of his neighbors. They were terrified of the plague, of the deaths that seemed to come from nowhere. But now, they were terrified of something else. The mob. And the Jews. The village was split. Some villagers, including Thomas's father, believed that the rumors were just that, rumors. "The Jews have always lived peacefully here," his father would say. "There is no reason to believe these lies." But other villagers, swept up by the fear, began to call for action. They wanted to take matters into their own hands. They wanted to protect their families, even if it meant blaming someone else. Late one night, Thomas overheard a heated argument between two men near his home. "We should go to the Jews' homes, drag them out," and burn them, one man suggested, his voice filled with hatred. They are the cause of our suffering. They are the poison that is destroying us. Thomas's heart raced as he listened to the words. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The violence was real. The hatred was real. And now, the people of Alston were preparing to do something terrible. The next day, a group of angry villagers gathered in the town square. The streets were filled with a tense silence, broken only by the murmurs of the crowd. As Thomas walked through the square, he noticed the growing anger in their faces, the way their eyes burned with hatred. They were no longer just afraid of the plague, now, they were afraid of the people they had once called neighbors. The mob was growing, and Thomas felt trapped between two worlds. He knew that violence would only make things worse. But how could he stand against it? How could he fight back against the fear that had taken hold of the village? That night, as the moon hung high in the sky, Thomas sat in his home, his mind racing. The voices of the mob echoed in his head, their demands for action growing louder. He could feel the weight of their anger pressing down on him. And then, just as he feared, the mob arrived at his door. They were demanding that he join them. "Thomas," one of the villagers said, his voice harsh. "You know what needs to be done. The Jews are the cause of this plague. We can't let them destroy us." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the pressure building. This was the moment of choice. Would he stand up for what he knew was right, or would he be swept up in the tide of fear and violence? "Please, don't do this," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "This is wrong. The Jews have done nothing. The plague is not their fault. It's an illness, a disease. We can't blame others for our suffering." But his words were drowned out by the angry shouts of the mob. "You're a fool if you don't see the truth. The Jews are the cause of this." Thomas stood in the doorway, torn between his conscience and the anger of the crowd. He could feel the mob closing in, their eyes burning with hatred. With a heavy heart, Thomas knew he had to make a choice. Would he risk everything to stand against the mob? Or would he be swept up in the chaos, just like everyone else? The world was falling apart around him. And soon, Thomas would have to face the truth about what kind of man he truly was. Would he let fear destroy everything, or would he fight for what was right, no matter the cost? The plague had already taken its toll on Europe. The population had dwindled, leaving entire villages empty and the land scarred by death. But its effects stretched far beyond sickness. With fewer workers to tend the fields, landowners grew greedy. They raised rents, forced peasants to work harder, and took advantage of the desperate, impoverished farmers who were struggling to survive. The rich grew wealthier, and the poor, already burdened by the disease and loss, grew desperate. In the small village of Alston, life had become harder than ever. The town, once bustling with trade and life, was now filled with sorrow. Thomas watched as his neighbors struggled, their crops failing, their pockets empty, and their families sick. The blacksmith's shop, his father's pride, was no longer as busy as it once had been. His father, once strong and full of life, now seemed older, more fragile. But it wasn't just the plague that weighed on the villagers. The rising rents were the final straw. The noblemen who owned the land surrounding Alston had raised their demands once again. The peasants, already struggling to make ends meet, found themselves facing the impossible: work harder for less, or face eviction. The anger in the village grew, and whispers of revolt began to spread. At first, it seemed like a distant thought, an idea that could never become reality. But as the situation worsened, it became clear that the people had reached their breaking point. They would no longer stand idly by and be crushed under the weight of the landowners' greed. In the summer of 1358, the peasants rose up. They took up arms, whatever they could find, tools, pitchforks, and knives, and marched toward the local lord's manor. Their faces were filled with anger and fear, their eyes wild with a mix of desperation and hope. This was their chance to take back control, to demand justice for all the years of suffering. Thomas could feel the tension in the air as he stood at the edge of the village. He had heard the shouts of the mob, the banging of makeshift weapons as the peasants gathered in the square. His sister, Mary, stood beside him, her face set in determination. She had always believed that the peasants were treated unfairly, that the nobles took too much and gave too little. Now, she believed this was their time to fight back. "This is it, Thomas," Mary said, her voice full of conviction. "The nobles have taken everything from us. It's time to take it back." Thomas looked at his sister, his heart heavy. He knew she was right. The peasants had been pushed to the brink for far too long. But even so, he wasn't sure if violence was the answer. He had seen what the plague had done, how it had torn apart families and villages. And he feared that this revolt, like the plague, would only bring more death and suffering. "We can't fight fire with fire, Mary," Thomas said softly. "Violence will only lead to more death. Look at what the plague has done to us already. We've lost so much. We can't lose more." Mary's eyes flashed with frustration. "Do you think we have a choice? We've been treated like animals for too long. These nobles think they can control us, take everything we have. It's time to show them we're not afraid." But Thomas knew the risks. The rebellion, while just, could easily turn into something far worse. History was full of uprisings that started with hope and ended in tragedy. He had to choose. Would he stand with his sister, with the peasants who had nothing left to lose, or would he try to prevent the bloodshed that seemed inevitable? As the mob marched toward the Lord's manor, Thomas and Mary found themselves caught between two worlds. On one side, there were the peasants, angry and desperate, fighting for their survival. On the other, there were the nobles, determined to maintain their control, unwilling to give up their wealth and power. The Lord's manor, a large stone building at the edge of the village, loomed in the distance. The peasants, shouting for justice, grew louder as they neared the gates. Thomas could see the fear in the faces of the noble soldiers as they prepared for the coming assault. There was no turning back now. Thomas's heart raced as he walked beside Mary. He knew she was ready to fight, ready to bring down the walls that had kept her and the other peasants under the thumb of the landowners. But Thomas wasn't sure he was ready for what would come next. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him: stand with the rebels, or try to stop them before it was too late. As the mob reached the gates of the manor, the Lord's soldiers took up their positions, drawing their swords and preparing to defend their property. Thomas could see the tension in the air, the inevitable clash that was about to take place. The peasants were armed with little more than farming tools, while the soldiers were well-trained and well-equipped. Mary grabbed Thomas's arm, pulling him forward. "This is our chance, Thomas. We can't stop now." Thomas hesitated, his mind torn. He could feel the pull of justice, the desire to stand with the oppressed. But he also knew that this revolt could lead to destruction that would hurt not just the nobles, but the peasants too. "Please, Mary," Thomas pleaded. "This isn't the way. We can fight for change without killing." But Mary was already moving forward, joining the angry mob that was demanding justice. The gates of the manor were being torn down, the peasants screaming for blood. Thomas knew it was too late to stop them now. The revolt had begun, and it would not end quietly. As the mob stormed the gates and the battle began, Thomas watched from the edge, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the violence would only bring more pain. Would they achieve justice, or would they only make the suffering worse? The answer, Thomas knew, would not be clear until it was too late. In that moment, as the clash of metal and the cries of anger filled the air, Thomas realized the world was changing. There would be no going back. The Battle of Agincourt would be remembered for centuries. It was a clash between the English and the French, two of the most powerful nations in Europe, and it was a battle that seemed impossible to win. The English army, led by the young and determined King Henry V, was heavily outnumbered. Yet, against all odds, the English emerged victorious. But the shock of the battle didn't come from the bloodshed or the sound of clashing swords, it came from what happened after the battle was won. Thomas had never seen such carnage. As the English forces celebrated their unexpected victory, the ground was littered with bodies, English and French alike. The cries of the dying echoed across the battlefield, and the air was thick with the stench of blood and death. It was a victory, yes, but it felt empty. The soldiers, exhausted from the fight, tried to find comfort in their triumph, but for Thomas, the horror of what he had witnessed was far from over. Among the slain, Thomas spotted a familiar face, William. The boy he had known as a child was now a man, his face weathered and scarred by the years of war. William had grown up with Thomas in their small village of Alston, and the two had once dreamed of a future that was full of possibilities. But now, as Thomas stood before him, William seemed like a stranger. His once bright eyes were dull, haunted by the horrors he had seen on the battlefield. "Thomas," William said, his voice rough from the fighting, "I never thought I'd see you here." Thomas couldn't find words at first. The sight of the dead, the wounded, and the wreckage of the battlefield left him in shock. He had never imagined war would be like this. The stories he had heard of knights and glory seemed far removed from the grim reality he faced now. The men who had fought alongside him were not heroes, they were just survivors of a brutal conflict. "I didn't think it would be like this," Thomas finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought war would be different." William let out a bitter laugh. "War is nothing like they tell you, Thomas. It's not about honor. It's not about glory. It's about surviving, about killing before you get killed. It's the worst thing I've ever seen." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "But we won. We beat them." "Did we?" William asked, his eyes darkening. "What have we really won, Thomas? Thousands of men died here, and for what? A piece of land? A crown? What does any of it matter when you've seen this?" He gestured around at the field of corpses. "Do you know how many men I've killed? How many men I've watched die? It's more than I can count." Thomas could see the pain in his friend's eyes. War had changed him. It had changed them all. The battlefield was a place where men were slaughtered in moments, their lives reduced to nothing more than blood on the ground. The men who had fought at Agincourt were not heroes, they were victims of a system that turned them into killers. As night fell, the soldiers began to gather around campfires, the glow of the flames casting shadows over their tired faces. Some laughed, some cried, but there was no real joy in the victory. Thomas could see it in the eyes of the men. The war had taken something from them, something they might never get back. That's when Thomas noticed something strange. As he walked past a small group of soldiers, he saw them dragging a group of wounded French soldiers toward the center of the camp. The men were beaten, bloodied, their bodies barely holding together. They had been captured during the battle, and now they were being led toward the campfire where the English commanders stood. At first, Thomas thought it was just another prisoner being brought in for questioning. But then, as the soldiers came closer, he heard the order. The commander, a man with a cruel, cold face, spoke in a low voice. "Kill them. No prisoners." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean, kill them?" he asked, stepping forward. "They're prisoners. They've surrendered." The commander's gaze turned cold as he looked at Thomas. "The king's orders. No mercy. No prisoners. We don't need any more trouble from the French." Thomas was stunned. "But these men are already defeated. Why kill them?" The commander's face remained impassive. "Because that's what we do now. Victory comes with consequences. And the king has spoken. These men are the enemy, and the enemy must die." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. These were men who had already been defeated. They were no longer a threat. Yet they were being executed in cold blood, their lives ended not by the sword of battle, but by the hand of a man who had already won. He turned to William, his stomach churning. Is this really what we've become? This is the price of victory? William didn't answer at first. He just stared at the scene before him, his face hard. This is what it means to win. The king wants to send a message, to show the French that we won't stop until we've crushed them completely. He doesn't want to leave anything behind that could come back to haunt us. Thomas felt a wave of disgust wash over him. This wasn't victory. It was murder. These men, who had already lost, were being slaughtered like animals. And he was a part of it. He had fought for this, stood beside men who had killed others in the name of glory and honor. But now, standing in the cold light of truth, he saw it for what it truly was. Is this the price of victory? Is this what war truly costs? Thomas didn't know anymore. But as the screams of the French soldiers echoed into the night, he realized that some victories come at a price too high to ever be justified. The battle was over, but the real war, the war for Thomas's soul, had only just begun. The year was 1453, and the world was about to change forever. The mighty Byzantine Empire, which had stood for over 1,000 years, was crumbling. The once great city of Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, was under siege by the Ottoman Turks. The city's walls, which had withstood countless assaults over the centuries, were now being tested in a way they never had before. The people of Constantinople fought fiercely to defend their home, but the odds were against them. The Ottoman forces, led by the ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, were relentless, and they had one goal in mind: to take the city and bring an end to an empire that had been one of the greatest in history. For Thomas, now older and wiser, the news of the fall of Constantinople was a bitter pill to swallow. As a young man, he had heard stories of the city's incredible wealth, its culture, and its great leaders. He had heard of the beauty of its architecture, the grandeur of its palaces, and the wisdom of its scholars. Constantinople was the last bastion of the ancient world, a city that had survived the rise and fall of countless empires. It seemed unthinkable that it could fall, but now, Thomas knew that the end had come. The siege of Constantinople had been long and brutal. For weeks, the people inside the city had fought off wave after wave of Ottoman attacks. The Ottoman army, though vast and well-equipped, had not been able to breach the city's mighty walls. But as the days turned into weeks, the defenders of Constantinople began to grow weary. Supplies were running low, and the city was slowly being starved into submission. The once thriving streets were now eerily silent, the markets empty, and the air thick with fear. Thomas had heard about the siege from distant travelers, merchants, and sailors who had escaped the city's grasp. They spoke of the hopelessness that had gripped the people of Constantinople as the Ottoman forces grew ever closer. The city, which had once been a symbol of power and culture, was now surrounded by enemies on all sides. The once great Byzantine navy had been defeated, and the land forces were struggling to hold their ground. Sultan Mehmed II, determined to bring Constantinople to its knees, had brought in massive cannons, some of the largest ever seen, to break through the city's ancient walls. As the walls finally began to crumble under the weight of the Ottoman artillery, the people of Constantinople knew the end was near. The defenders fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed. On May 29, 1453, after a fierce battle, the city's gates were breached. The Ottomans poured into Constantinople, and the great city fell. For Thomas, the fall of Constantinople marked the end of an era. The city, which had once stood as the proud center of the Byzantine Empire, was now a shattered shell of its former self. The cries of the fallen echoed through the streets, and the once beautiful buildings were reduced to rubble. The grand churches, the magnificent palaces, and the libraries filled with ancient knowledge were now lost to history. The fall of Constantinople was not just the fall of a city, it was the fall of an entire way of life, a way of life that had shaped the world for over 1,000 years. But as the Ottomans entered the city and began their conquest, Thomas couldn't help but wonder, how had such a mighty civilization fallen? Was it simply because they were outnumbered and outmatched, or was there more to the story? The Byzantine Empire had once been one of the most powerful forces in the world, but now it lay in ruins. What had gone wrong? In the midst of the chaos, as the Ottoman soldiers flooded the city, Thomas overheard whispers of something strange. Some of the surviving citizens spoke of a mysterious artifact, a powerful object hidden deep within the city's walls. This artifact, they said, had the potential to change the course of history. Some believed it had the power to save the city, others that it was the key to its downfall. The rumors were unclear, but one thing was certain: the artifact was important, and it was somewhere in the heart of Constantinople. Thomas's curiosity was piqued. He knew he had to find out more about this mysterious artifact. If it was truly as powerful as the rumors suggested, it could be the key to understanding the true nature of the Byzantine Empire's fall. But before he could uncover the truth, the city was overrun. The Ottomans, now in control, began to tear the city apart, looting its treasures and burning what remained. The people of Constantinople were either slaughtered or enslaved, their fate sealed by the invading forces. As the Ottomans marched through the streets, Thomas searched for any sign of the artifact, but the city had become a war zone. Buildings were collapsing, fires raged, and the once beautiful streets were now filled with the dead and dying. It was impossible to know where to begin, and with the chaos around him, Thomas knew he would never be able to find the artifact. The mystery of what it was, and what it could have done, would remain unsolved. In the end, the fall of Constantinople was more than just the end of a city, it was the end of an era. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived for over 1,000 years, was no more. The Ottoman Empire would rise to power, and the world would change in ways that no one could have predicted. But for Thomas, the fall of Constantinople represented something deeper. It was a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, could last forever. Even the greatest civilizations could fall, and when they did, their secrets, their treasures, and their mysteries were often lost to history. As the Ottomans took control of the city, Thomas walked through the rubble, his mind heavy with the knowledge that he had witnessed the end of something truly great. The city that had once been a symbol of hope and strength was now gone. And with it, the dream of 1,000 years had faded into the past. The fall of Constantinople was a reminder that the rise and fall of empires were not determined by power alone, but by the shifting currents of history, and by forces far beyond any one man's control. The end of the 15th century marked the closing of an era. The medieval age, with all its grandeur and sorrow, was beginning to fade. The world, which had been shaped by kings, castles, and endless wars, was now transforming. New ideas, new technologies, and new lands were opening up to humanity. The balance of power in Europe was shifting, and with it, the very way people thought about their place in the world was changing. For Thomas, now an old man, the world seemed unrecognizable. He had lived through so much: plagues that ravaged his village, wars that destroyed entire cities, and the rise and fall of kingdoms. He had witnessed the fall of Constantinople, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and the many revolts that had shaken the foundations of society. Yet, even as he reflected on the darkness of the past, there was something else stirring within him, a glimmer of hope. As he sat by his fire one evening, the warmth of the flames flickering on his weathered face, Thomas thought about all the changes he had seen. The world had been cruel to him, to his friends, and to his family. But the horrors he had witnessed had also led to something new, the dawn of the Renaissance. People were beginning to think differently, to challenge the old ways of thinking. The ideas that had once been considered heresy were now gaining acceptance. The world was starting to look forward, not just backward. Thomas had seen the old ways crumble. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, was now breaking apart. The rise of powerful monarchies, like the French and English crowns, was leading to more centralized forms of government. The power of the Church, once absolute, was beginning to wane as new philosophies took hold. Even the social structure was changing, with merchants and craftsmen gaining influence over the nobility. But perhaps the most exciting change was the beginning of exploration. The discovery of new lands was sending shockwaves across Europe. The Portuguese and Spanish had begun their journeys to the unknown world, opening up trade routes and bringing back treasures that had once been thought of as fantasy. Christopher Columbus had crossed the ocean and found new shores, changing the map of the world forever. The possibilities were endless, and the excitement of these discoveries was felt by everyone, from the lowliest peasants to the wealthiest kings. For Thomas, these changes were bittersweet. He had lived through the destruction of so much, his village, his family, and the world he had known. But he could see that the future was unfolding before him. The darkness of the past was slowly being replaced by a new light. People were beginning to look at the world with fresh eyes, questioning the old truths and searching for new ones. In the streets of the cities, men and women gathered to discuss philosophy, art, and science. Great thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were emerging, their ideas pushing the boundaries of what humanity had once thought possible. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg, was spreading knowledge faster than ever before, allowing books to reach people who had never had access to them before. Ideas that had been confined to the wealthy elite were now accessible to everyone, and the world was beginning to change in ways no one had ever imagined. But even as Thomas saw the potential for a brighter future, he couldn't forget the lessons of the past. He had seen empires rise and fall, witnessed wars that tore nations apart, and experienced the horrors of the plague and famine. He knew that the mistakes of the past could easily be repeated. The greed, the violence, the intolerance, they were still there, lurking beneath the surface. The future might be brighter, but it was not guaranteed. As Thomas gazed out over the land he had known his entire life, he wondered, what comes next? Will humanity rise from the ashes of the past, or will the mistakes of the medieval age be repeated? The world was changing, but would it be for the better? He didn't know. But for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of hope. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility. The world was no longer trapped in the past, and that was a victory in itself. The Renaissance was just the beginning, and who knew what discoveries, what advancements, what miracles might come next. The people of Thomas's generation had fought and struggled to survive, but now it was the turn of the younger generations to build a new world, one that might learn from the mistakes of the past and create something better. As the evening sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above, Thomas knew that he had lived through something extraordinary. He had seen the end of an age and the beginning of a new one. He had seen empires fall, but he had also seen the seeds of a new world being planted. The world was changing, and he was witnessing it firsthand. He could only hope that the future would be brighter than the past, and that humanity would rise above the mistakes that had plagued it for so long. But for now, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the night grew colder, Thomas sat back in his chair, content. The world was changing, and he had been a part of it. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure: humanity's story was far from over. The suspense of what the future would bring hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a spark of excitement. The world was on the cusp of something new, and the possibilities were endless. What would come next? No one could say for sure, but it was a journey worth taking.